Chapter 7, God on the Dock. Let's pray the human race never escapes earth to spread its iniquity elsewhere. C.S. Lewis. Mac stood in the bathroom, looking into the mirror while wiping his face dry with a towel. He was searching for some sign of insanity in those eyes staring back at him. Was this real? Of course not. It was impossible, but then he reached out his hand and slowly touched the mirror. Maybe this was a hallucination being brought on by all his grief and despair. Maybe it was a dream and he was asleep somewhere, maybe in the shack, freezing to death. Maybe suddenly a terrible crash broke into his reverie. It came, Reverie, I'm not sure what it means. It came from the direction of the kitchen, and Mac froze. For a moment, there was dead silence. And then, unexpectedly, he heard uproarious laughter. Curious, he exited the bedroom and poked his head through the doorway of the kitchen. Mac was shocked at the scene in front of him. It appeared that Jesus had dropped a large bowl of some sort of batter or sauce on the floor, and it was everywhere. It must have landed close to Papa because the lower portion of her skirt and bare feet were covered in the gooey mess. All three were laughing so hard that Mac didn't think they were breathing. Sarayu said something about humans being clumsy and all. All three started roaring again. Finally, Jesus brushed past Mac and returned a minute later with a large basin of water and towels. And Sarayu had already started wiping the goop from the floor and cupboards. But Jesus went straight to Papa and, kneeling at her feet, began to wipe off the front of her clothes. He worked down to her feet and gently lifted one foot at a time, which he directed into the basin where he cleaned and massaged it. "Ooh, that feels so good," exclaimed Papa as she continued her tasks at the counter. As he leaned against the doorway watching, Mac's mind was full of thoughts. So this was God in relationship. It was beautiful and so appealing. He knew that it didn't matter whose fault it is, the mess from some bowl had been broken. That a dish that had been planned would not be shared. Obviously, what was truly important here was the love they had for one another and the fullness it brought them. He shook his head. How different this was from the way he treated the ones he loved. Supper was simple, but a feast nonetheless. Roast bird of some kind in an orangey, mangoey kind of sauce. Fresh vegetables spiced with who but God knew what. Who but God knew what. All fruity and gingery, tangy and peppery. Rice, the quality of which Mac had never before tasted, could have been a meal by itself. The only awkward part was at the very beginning, when Mac, out of habit, bowed his head before he remembered where he was. He looked up to find all three of them grinning at him. So as nonchalantly as he could, he asked, "Thank you all. Could I have a bit of that rice then?" That rice there. Sure, we were going to have this incredible Japanese sauce, but greasy fingers over there, Papa nodded toward Jesus, decided to see if it would bounce. "Come on now," Jesus responded in mock defense. My hands were slippery. What can I say?" Papa winked at Mac as she passed him the rice. "You just can't get good help around here." Everyone laughed. Conversation seemed almost normal. Mac was asked about each of the children, except Missy. And he talked about their various struggles and triumphs, When he spoke of his concerns for Kate, the three only nodded with concerned expressions, but offered him no counsel or wisdom. He also answered questions about his friends, and Sarayu seemed most interested in asking about Nan. Finally, Mac blurted out something that had been bothering him throughout the discussion. Now, here I am telling you about my kids and my friends and about Nan, but you already know everything that I'm telling you, don't you? You're acting like it's the first time you heard it. Sarayu reached across the table and took his hand. Mackenzie, remember our conversation earlier about limitation? Our conversation? He glanced over at Papa, who was nodding knowingly. You can't share with one and not share with us all, Sarayu said and smiled. Remember that choosing to stay on the ground is a choice to facilitate a relationship. To honor it, Mackenzie, you do this yourself. You don't play a game or color a picture with a child to show your superiority. Rather, you choose to limit yourself so as to facilitate and honor that relationship. You will even lose a competition to accomplish love. It's not about winning and losing, but about love and respect. So when I am telling you about my children, we have limited ourselves out of respect for you. We are not bringing to mind, as it were, our knowledge of your children. As we are listening to you, it is as if this is the first time we have known about them, and we take great delight in seeing them through your eyes. I like that, reflected Max, sitting back in his chair. Sarayu squeezed his head. Sarayu squeezed his hand, and seemed to sit back. I do too. Relationships are never about power, and one way to avoid the will to power is to choose to limit oneself to serve. Humans often do this, in touching the infirm and sick, in serving the ones whose minds have left to wander, in relating to the poor, in loving the very old and the very young, or even in caring for the other who has assumed a position of power over them. Well spoken, Sarayu, said Papa, her face beaming with pride. I'll take care of the dishes later, but first I would like to have a time of devotion. Mac had to suppress a snicker at the thought of God having devotions. Images of family devotions from his childhood came spilling into his mind. Not exactly good memories, with the right answers, or rather, the same old answers to the same old Bible story questions, and then trying to stay awake during his father's excruciatingly long prayers. And when his father had been drinking, family devotions devolved into a terrifying minefield where any wrong answer or inadvertent glance could trigger an explosion. He half expected Jesus to pull out a huge old King James Bible. Instead, Jesus reached across the table and took Papa's hands in his. Scars now clearly visible on his wrists, Matt sat transfixed as he watched Jesus kiss his father's hands, and then look deep into his father's eyes and finally say, Papa, I loved watching you today as you made yourself fully available to take Mac's pain into yourself and then give him space to choose his own timing. You honored him and you honored me. To listen to you whisper love and calm into his heart was truly incredible. What a joy to watch. I love being your son. Although Mac felt like he was intruding, no one else seemed concerned, and he really had no idea where he would have gone in any case. To be in the presence of such love expressed seemed to dislodge an inner emotional logjam, and while he didn't understand exactly what he felt, it was good. What was he witnessing? Something simple, warm, intimate, genuine. This was holy. Holiness had always been a cold and sterile concept to Mac, but this was neither. Concerned that any movement on his part might shatter the moment, he simply closed his eyes and folded his hands in front of him, listening intently with his eyes shut. He heard Jesus move his chair. There was a pause before he spoke again. "Sarayu," Jesus began softly and tenderly, "you wash, I'll dry." Mac's eyes snapped open in time to see the two smiling broadly at each other, picking up the dishes and disappearing into the kitchen. He sat for a few minutes, unsure about what to do. Papa had gone somewhere, and now that the other two were busy with dishes, well, it was an easy decision. He picked up the silverware and glasses and he headed for the kitchen. As soon as he had put them down for Sarayu to wash, Jesus tossed him a dish towel, and they both began drying. Sarayu began humming the same evocative tune he'd heard earlier with Papa, and Jesus and Mac simply listened as they worked. More than once, the melody stirred Mac deep inside, knocking again at the door. To him, it sounded Gaelic, and he could almost hear breath pipes in accompaniment. But as difficult as it was for Mac to stay and allow his emotions to well up so powerfully, the melody absolutely captured him. If he could just keep listening to her, he would be thrilled to do dishes the rest of his life. 10 minutes or so later, they were finished. Jesus kissed Sarayu on the cheek, and she disappeared around the corner. He then turned and smiled at Mac. "Let's go out on the dock and look at the stars." "What about the others?" Mac asked. "I'm here," replied Jesus. "I'm always here." Mac nodded. This presence of God thing, although hard to grasp, seemed to be steadily penetrating past his mind and into his heart. He let it go at that. "Come on," said Jesus, interrupting Mac's thoughts. "I know you enjoy looking at stars. Want to?" He sounded just like a child, full of anticipation and expectancy. "Yeah, I think so," answered Mac, realizing that the last time he had done that was on the ill-fated camping trip with the kids. Maybe it was time to take a few risks. He followed Jesus out the back door. In the waning moments of twilight, Mac could make out the rocky shore of the lake, not overgrown as he remembered, but beautifully kept and picture perfect. The nearby creek seemed to be humming some sort of musical tune. Protruding about 50 feet into the lake was a dock, and Mac could barely make out 3 canoes tied at intervals along its course. Night was falling quickly, and the distant darkness was already thick with the sounds of crickets and bullfrogs. Jesus took his arm and led him up the path while his eyes adjusted. But already Mac was looking up into a moonless night at the wonder of the emerging stars. They made their way 3/4 up the dock and lay down on their backs looking up. The elevation of this place seemed to magnify the heavens, and Mac reveled in seeing stars in such numbers and clarity. Mac reveled in seeing stars in such numbers and clarity. Jesus suggested that they close their eyes for a few minutes, allowing the last effects of dusk to disappear for the night. Mac complied, and when he finally opened his eyes, the sight was so powerful that he experienced vertigo for a few seconds. It almost felt like he was falling up into space, the stars racing toward him as if to embrace him. He lifted his hands, imagining that he could reach out and pluck diamonds, one by one, off a velvet black sky. "Wow," he whispered. "Incredible," whispered Jesus, his head near Mac's in the darkness. "I never get tired of this." "Even though you created it?" Mac asked. "I created it as the Word, before the Word became flesh. So even though I created this, I see it now as a human, and I must say, it is impressive." It certainly is. Mac was not sure how to describe what he felt, but as they continued to lie in silence, gazing into the celestial display, watching and listening, he knew in his heart that this too was holy. As they both watched in awestruck wonder, shooting stars would occasionally blaze a brief trail across the night blackness, causing one or the other to exclaim, "Did you see that? Awesome." After a particularly long silence, Max spoke. "I feel more comfortable around you. You seem so different than the other two." "How do you mean different?" came his soft voice out of the darkness. "Well," Mac paused as he thought about it, "more real or tangible. I don't know." He struggled with the words, and Jesus lay quiet, waiting. "It's like I've always known you, but Papa isn't at all what I expected from God, and Sarayu, she's way out there. She's way out there." Jesus chuckled in the dark. "Since I am human, we have much in common to begin with. But I still don't understand. I am the best way any human can relate to Papa or Sarayu. To see me is to see them. The love you sense from me is no different from how they love you. And believe me, Papa and Sarayu are just as real as I am, though, as you've seen, in far different ways. I am the best way any human can relate to Papa or Sarayu. To see me is to see them. The love you sense from me is no different from how they love you. And believe me, Papa and Sarayu are just as real as I am, though, as you've seen, in far different ways." Speaking of Sarayu, is she the Holy Spirit? Yes, she is creativity. She is action. She is the breathing of life. She is much more. She is my spirit. And her name, Sarayu? That is a simple name from one of our human languages. It means wind. A common wind, actually. She loves that name. Grunted Mac. Nothing too common about her. True that, responded Jesus. And the name Papa mentioned, Eloisa, the voice spoke reverently from the dark next to him. That is a wonderful name. El is my name as Creator God, but Oisa is being, or that which is truly real. So the name means the Creator God, who is truly real and the ground of all being. Now that is also a beautiful name. There was a silence for a minute when Mac pondered what Jesus had said. So then, Where does that leave us? He felt like he was asking the question for the entire human race. Right where you were always intended to be, in the very center of our love and our purpose. Again, a pause. Then, I suppose I can live with that. Jesus chuckled. I'm glad to hear that, and they both laughed. Neither spoke for a time. Stillness had fallen like a blanket, and all Mac was really aware of was the sound of water lapping up against the dock. It was he who eventually broke the silence again. Jesus? Yes, Mackenzie. I'm surprised by one thing about you. Really? What? I guess I expected you to be more... Be careful here, Mac. Well, humanly striking. Jesus chuckled. Humanly striking? You mean handsome? And now he was laughing. Well, I was trying to avoid that, but yes, somehow I thought you'd be the ideal man, athletic and overwhelmingly good looking. It's my nose, isn't it? Mac didn't know what to say. Jesus laughed. I am Jewish, My grandfather on my mother's side had a big nose. In fact, most of the men on my mom's side had big noses. I just thought you'd be better looking. By whose standards? Anyway, once you really get to know me, it won't matter to you. The words, though delivered kindly, stung. Stung what exactly? Mac lay there a few seconds and realized that as much as he thought he knew Jesus, perhaps he didn't. Not really. Maybe what he knew was an icon, an ideal, an image through which he tried to grasp a sense of spirituality, but not a real person. Why is that? He finally asked. You said if I really knew you, it wouldn't matter what you looked like. It is quite simple, really. Being always transcends appearance, that which only seems to be. Once you begin to know the being behind the very pretty or very ugly face as determined by your bias, the surface appearances fade away until they simply no longer matter. That is why Eloisa is such a wonderful name. God, who is the ground of all being, dwells in, around, and through all things, ultimately emerging as the real. And any appearances that mask that reality will fall away. Silence followed as Mac wrestled with what Jesus had said. He gave up after only a minute or two and decided to ask the riskier question. You said I don't really know you. It would be a lot easier if we could always talk like this. Admittedly, Mac, this is special. You were really stuck and we wanted to help you crawl out of your pain. But don't think that just because I'm not visible, our relationship has to be less real. It will be different, but perhaps even more real. How is that? My purpose from the beginning was to live in you and you in me. Wait a minute. How can that happen if you're still fully human? How can you be inside me? Astounding, isn't it? It's Papa's miracle. It's the power of Sarayu, my spirit. The Spirit of God who restores the union that was lost so long ago. Me? I choose to live moment by moment, fully human. I am fully God, but I am human to the core. Like I said, it's Papa's miracle. Mac was lying in the darkness, listening intently. Aren't you talking about a real indwelling, not just some positional, theological thing? Of course, answered Jesus, his voice strong and sure. It's what everything is all about. The human formed out of the physical material. Creation can once more be fully indwelt by spiritual life, my life. It requires that a very real, dynamic, and active union exists. That is almost unbelievable, Mac exclaimed quietly. I have no idea. I need to think more about this, but I might have a lot more questions. And we have your lifetime to sort through them, Jesus chuckled, but enough of that for now. Let's get lost again in the starry night. In the silence that followed, Max simply lay still, allowing the immensity of space and scattered light to dwarf him, letting his perceptions be captured by starlight and the thought that everything was about him, about the human race, that all this was for us. After what seemed like a long time, it was Jesus who broke into the quiet. I'll never get tired of looking at this, the wonder of it all, the wastefulness of creation, as one of our brothers has called it. So elegant, so full of longing and beauty even now. You know, Mac responded, suddenly struck anew by the absurdity of his situation, where he was the person next to him. Sometimes you sound so... here I'm lying next to God Almighty, and you really sound so... human? Jesus offered, but ugly? And with that, he began to chuckle, quietly and restrained at first, but after a couple snorts, laughter simply started tumbling out. It was infectious, and Mac found himself swept along from somewhere deep inside. He had not laughed from down there in a long time. Jesus reached over and hugged him, shaking from his own spasms of mirth, and Mac felt more clean and alive, and, than he had since, he couldn't remember since when. Eventually, they both calmed again, and the night's quiet asserted itself once more. It seemed that even the frogs had called it quits. Mac lay there, realizing that he was now feeling guilty about enjoying himself, about laughing. And even in the darkness, he could feel the great sadness roll in and over him. Jesus, he whispered as his voice choked, I feel so lost. A hand reached out and squeezed his and didn't let go. I know, Mac, but it's not true. I am with you and I'm not lost. I'm sorry it feels that way, but hear me clearly. You are not lost. I hope you're right, Max said, his tension lessened by the words of his newfound friend. Come on, said Jesus, standing up and reaching down for Mac. You have a big day ahead of you. Let's get you to bed. He put his arm around Mac's shoulder, and together they walked back toward the cabin. Mac was suddenly exhausted. Today had been one long day. Maybe he would wake up at home, in his own bed, after a night of vivid dreaming, but somewhere inside, he hoped he was wrong. That's chapter 7, chapter 8, mañana.